Ely is arguably the most important archaeological discovery in recent years. After weeks of silence from the excavation team at Göbekli Tepe, something had clearly shifted. Reporters on the ground couldn't believe what they were hearing. Göbekli was a game share, but I think it's a game share for everything. Stories started to spread, first among local journalists, then picked up by international science outlets. A chamber hidden, sealed, untouched for over 10,000 years had just been opened. What was inside left even the most seasoned scientists at a loss for words. This is the story behind the dig that stunned everyone. In context, in the southeastern corner of Turkey, about 35 miles north of the Syrian border, lies a site that has quietly rewritten everything we thought we knew about human history, Göbekli. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish, and for a long time that's all it was, a hill. But in the 1990s, what seemed like just another rise in the terrain turned out to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries ever made. Göbekli isn't a city. It isn't a settlement. There are no homes or cooking pits in the earliest layers. And yet, standing stones weighing between 10 and 20,000 pounds, some nearly 20 foot tall, have been arranged in large circular enclosures. Each of those enclosures appears to have had a purpose, and every piece of the layout suggests ritual, not domestic life. This site is at least 11,000 years old. That means it predates the invention of the wheel, agriculture, and metal tools. To put that into perspective, Göbekli was built more than 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza and over 7,000 years before Stonehenge. That kind of timing doesn't just push back the history of monumental construction. It completely changes the timeline of human organization and capability. Archaeologists initially thought that large-scale architecture began only after humans developed farming and began living in permanent settlements, but Göbekli challenges that directly. Its builders were likely hunter-gatherers. There's no evidence of domesticated plants or animals in the early layers. They weren't using pottery, and they weren't living in one place year-round. And yet they worked together to build a site using limestone pillars carved with strange stylized animal forms like foxes, snakes, vultures, boars, and humanoid figures. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led the excavation for years, was the first to understand the significance. When Klaus arrived at the site in the 1990s, local farmers had already uncovered carved stones while clearing their fields, but no one thought they were important. Klaus disagreed. He knew immediately what they had stumbled upon. These weren't the remains of a settlement. They were something older and more complex. Klaus and his team began methodically digging and found layer after layer of sculpted stone arranged with shocking precision. Each enclosure had a pair of central T-shaped pillars and was surrounded by smaller ones. The pillars were set into carved sockets in the limestone bedrock, showing that the builders had some understanding of planning, measurement, and permanence. The enclosures were then intentionally buried. At some point, possibly after decades or even centuries of use, each circle was filled in with rubble, fist-sized stones, fragments of tools, and animal bones. This act of burial wasn't accidental. It was part of the design. Göbekli wasn't just built. It was sealed, and it stayed that way for thousands of years. By the time Klaus passed away in 2014, only a small portion of the site had been excavated. Fewer than 10% of the estimated structures have been uncovered. Yet, what has already come out of the ground has left archaeologists and historians stunned. Some believe Göbekli was the world's first temple. Others argue it's the oldest known religious sanctuary. Whatever term is used, one thing is clear. The builders had the organization, motivation, and skills to create something far bigger than themselves for a purpose that still isn't fully understood. Excavation work has since continued under the supervision of Turkish archaeologists with support from the German Archaeological Institute. Each new season has revealed more questions than answers. But what's never changed is the site's importance. It tells us that belief, ritual, ceremony, meaning may have come before farming. That instead of agriculture leading to religion, it may have been the other way around. For the past few years, Göbekli Tepe has been part of a broader archaeological zone known as the Taş-Teller region. That zone includes several other sites with similar features, T-shaped pillars, communal layouts, and carved animals spread across southeastern Turkey. Each of them adds weight to the idea that this wasn't a one-off anomaly. It was a cultural system. And yet, even with all that has been found, the most striking part of the story might be what remains hidden. Beneath the soil, beneath layers of compacted earth and intentionally sealed enclosures lie features no one has seen for thousands of years. Researchers have only scratched the surface. The latest season of excavation didn't just confirm that, it proved it. One find in particular has left scientists speechless. A carved chamber that had never been touched in modern times. Digging deeper, archaeologists working at Göbekli today rely on more than shovels and brushes. The site's complexity, depth, and importance mean that every layer must be studied with precision before it's disturbed. That's where modern surveying and imaging tools come in. Before anyone removes even a single rock, researchers use ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity scans, and magnetometry to build underground maps of what might be hiding beneath the surface. These technologies helped narrow down excavation targets during the most recent field seasons. Instead of opening wide trenches at random, teams focus on anomalies, areas where the readings show breaks in the bedrock, dense clusters of stone, or signs of artificial construction. In the most promising areas, these surveys revealed voids and features just beneath the surface that didn't match any previously studied enclosures. Before active digging starts, the surface is documented in high resolution using drone photogrammetry. The images are stitched together to create 3D models, giving the researchers a permanent digital record of the site's condition before they begin. That also helps later when they try to reconstruct how stones were positioned and how soil layers developed over time. Once excavation starts, the process slows down dramatically. The soil at Göbekli Tepe is compacted and mixed with limestone rubble, animal bone, and tool fragments. Some deposited naturally, others by human activity. Teams work in small units, usually measuring no more than a few yards at a time, clearing soil in layers of just a few inches. Everything removed is sifted and catalogued. Soil samples are taken from key spots to check for micro-remains, burn seeds, pollen, or even ash traces. During recent work, the team made an unusual logistical move. They temporarily relocated olive trees that were growing directly over sensitive parts of the hill. The trees were not native to the site and were introduced in recent decades for cultivation. Moving them allowed access to areas that hadn't been touched in thousands of years while preserving the vegetation for later replanting. That step alone took several weeks and involved environmental consultants to avoid damage. Supervising the excavation is archaeologist Nexmi Karl, who leads current operations with Turkish oversight. Nexmi has continued the scientific and cautious approach first championed by earlier teams. He's also helped introduce more transparency through published reports and live field updates. Under his leadership, the excavation strategy has been refined to avoid overexposing structures too early. That means deeper features are only investigated when the team is sure they're stable and won't collapse during work. One of the more sophisticated tools used in this phase is a portable laser scanner. Once a new layer or architectural feature is exposed, it's scanned in 3D immediately. That way, if stones collapse or weather over time, researchers still have a full digital record accurate to millimeter-level precision. These models are now used not only for research but also to create replicas and conservation plans. Much of the recent work also involves vertical profiling. That means digging narrow shafts down through the site rather than wide trenches across it. This technique allows archaeologists to follow stratigraphy more carefully, especially in areas where buildings may have been reused or buried deliberately. These vertical profiles have helped confirm that some enclosures were intentionally filled in using layers of rock and soil rather than slowly buried by time. In one specific section near the southern slope of the mound, readings showed an unusual shape buried less than 5 feet below the surface. It didn't match any known enclosure layout. And unlike the T-shaped pillars, this anomaly seemed cut directly into the bedrock rather than built on top of it. But instead of rushing in, the team spent weeks stabilizing the surrounding area and setting up protective barriers. The decision paid off. What they were about to uncover would challenge long-held assumptions about how space was used at Göbekli Tepe and why someone went to such great lengths to hide it. Signs of a hidden space. Not every discovery at Göbek begins with something visible. Sometimes it starts with something that doesn't quite belong. In one section of the site, researchers came across a part of the mound where the surface had settled differently. There was no obvious structure, no pillar fragments, no pattern of stone walls. But the ground itself was suspiciously level in some spots and unusually firm in others. To the naked eye, it looked unremarkable. But to experienced archaeologists, subtle changes in the soil can be enough to trigger a deeper investigation. What stood out in this particular zone was the lack of organic debris compared to the surrounding areas. Elsewhere across Göbekli Tepe, the ground often includes loose fragments, broken stone tools, animal bones, even ash layers. But here, the soil was tightly packed and had none of the usual scatter. That kind of cleanliness in an ancient site is rare and often artificial. Something had disturbed this section and then resealed it. As digging began, the soil color changed sharply at about 2 feet down. A darker compact fill gave way to lighter limestone dust, the kind you'd expect near bedrock. But what surprised the team even more was what came next. The tip of a smooth-cut vertical edge emerging from the dust like the corner of a buried monument. At first, it seemed like it could be part of a reused pillar, maybe one that had fallen and been covered over. But the shape was wrong. It wasn't rounded. It wasn't leaning. It was square, cleanly carved, and it didn't seem to stop. Within days, excavation revealed more. A sharply defined opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, framed by stone on all sides. Unlike the massive standing pillars seen elsewhere, this wasn't a freestanding structure. It was carved directly into the bedrock. The stone was part of the hill itself. The team had uncovered the top edge of a rectangular feature that didn't resemble anything they had seen before at the site. The opening measured just under 2.5 feet tall and about 2 feet wide. It had crisp edges and flat interior surfaces. To the left of the opening, faint relief carvings started to emerge. Curved lines and angled shapes that looked like stylized limbs. These were not just tool marks, they were intentional. One member of the team suggested that the layout looked almost like a niche or recessed doorway. Another proposed it might have been symbolic, meant to represent a passage or transition, even if it didn't lead anywhere. But no one could be sure. The carved area was sealed tight with compact soil, and the cavity behind it had not yet been explored. That alone was unusual. Most known features at Göbekli Tepe were either exposed on the surface when found or buried under mixed debris. This one was different. It was cut, carved, and then hidden. It didn't appear to have been part of any of the circular enclosures. It stood alone. By now, the working theory among the archaeologists was that they had found a chamber, not a room made from stacked stone walls like the usual enclosures, but a space dug straight into the hill. The precision of the carving, the positioning of the reliefs, and the surrounding undisturbed soil all pointed to a structure that had been intentionally closed off shortly after it was completed. What made it even more curious was the complete absence of disturbance above it. No trench marks, no fill that looked like a repair. Whatever had been done here had been done with care and then left untouched for thousands of years. At this point, the team halted their digging. Before going further, they brought in conservation experts and structural analysts to study the stability of the chamber. It wasn't clear how deep it went or what might lie behind the carved opening. Excavating too quickly could risk collapsing the structure or damaging any contents inside. According to insiders on the team, the excitement was growing, but so was the pressure. They knew they were looking at something unique. A cut chamber was unheard of at Göbekli Tepe until now. And unlike the open-air enclosures with their iconic pillars, this one felt deliberately sealed, like someone in the past had wanted to protect whatever was inside. They took detailed scans of the entrance, documenting every inch. They used micro cameras to peek into the gap where possible, but the inner space was blocked by debris and compacted earth. Whatever was inside hadn't been exposed in modern times. The team didn't yet know what they were about to find, but they did know this. They were staring at a carved chamber, hidden, buried, and unlike anything else uncovered at the site. And soon, the moment would come to open it. The moment. The team began clearing the debris around the carved stone surface slowly and with precision. There were no shortcuts at this point. Every handful of soil removed from the entrance cavity had to be documented and sifted. Even small fragments like charcoal, bone chips, and flint could shift the interpretation. The carved frame suggested something intentional, and the risk of damaging a previously sealed feature made everyone cautious. After nearly a week of clearing around the opening, the rectangular entrance stood fully exposed. It was clear scientists just dug at Göbekli Tepe and uncovered a chamber that left them speechless. The chamber opening measured just under 2.5 feet tall and around 2 feet wide. The interior was still blocked, filled with fine sediment and loose stone fragments. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just the entrance itself. It was the carved symbols that had become clearer as the dust was removed. One figure appeared to show a bent arm, another a looping shape that might represent a coiled animal or abstract form. It wasn't yet possible to identify the carvings with certainty, but they were consistent with the symbolic style found across other parts of the site. The interior space behind the entrance wasn't large. As archaeologist Lee Clare, one of the project's senior advisors, later explained to colleagues, it looked more like a niche than a full-sized room. But unlike the symbolic niches found in enclosure walls, this one was recessed into the actual bedrock. It wasn't decorative. It was structural. When the last of the fill was carefully removed, the chamber's shape became clear. It extended back about 3 feet and stood just tall enough for a person to crouch inside. Along the back wall, a shallow ledge had been carved about 8 in high and 18 in wide. The ledge was smooth like it had been shaped by hand tools. Above it, the ceiling sloped slightly inward, forming a tight, contained space. The moment the chamber was empty, the team stepped back. It wasn't dramatic in size. It wasn't filled with gold or objects, but the atmosphere around the find changed. The silence said more than words. For a site that had already changed how the world viewed prehistory, this new feature was entirely unexpected. There had been no signs pointing to a chamber like this anywhere else in Göbekli. The enclosures were always above ground. The pillars were exposed to the sky. The carvings faced outward. Everything about this new feature went in the opposite direction. Cut inward, sealed shut, no clear entrance pathway, and facing the earth rather than the sky. Nexmi Karu, the Turkish archaeologist overseeing the project, called in conservation experts immediately. They checked the structural integrity of the chamber walls and confirmed that the stone showed no major cracks or instability. That allowed researchers to enter the space briefly using handheld lights and surface scanners. Inside they found no major artifacts, but there were details that raised more questions. One small depression had been carved into the right wall about 4 in across and 2 in deep. Its purpose was unclear. The chamber floor had been intentionally smoothed. The ledge in the back had no burn marks, no charring, no staining. It didn't appear to have held a fire or a body. If it were an altar, it had been wiped clean. If it was a symbolic seat, it had been used and then sealed. From the outside, the chamber entrance looked like a false doorway, similar in concept to those carved into Egyptian tomb walls, meant to act as a passage for the soul. But Göbekli predates anything remotely similar by thousands of years. That comparison didn't sit easily with anyone on the team. It was too early to make claims. But everyone agreed on one thing. It's serious evidence that the chamber wasn't here by accident. By this point, the team had created full 3D scans of the chamber and the surrounding structure. Those scans showed precise alignment with nearby features, particularly a stone alignment that pointed roughly east. That detail may be coincidental or it may not, but to a team that had spent years documenting every inch of this site, it suggested the chamber had been placed with intent. The most striking part wasn't what the chamber held. It was how different it was from everything else on the hill. It was hidden. It was sealed. It was carved, not assembled. It wasn't meant to be seen from a distance or entered casually. And it broke every architectural pattern that defined Göbekli up to that point. After months of planning, measuring, and waiting, the team had finally opened a space that no one had looked inside for more than 10,000 years. What they found was evidence that even at Göbekli, a place already full of mysteries, there are still features we weren't prepared to find. Archaeological revelations. Once the initial documentation of the chamber was complete, researchers began analyzing what its presence actually meant. Even though it didn't contain artifacts, its design and context were enough to spark major questions. The structure was sealed, carved into the bedrock, and showed no signs of casual or repeated use. That alone made it different from almost everything else excavated at Göbekli. The most noticeable feature inside was the bench-like ledge carved directly into the back wall. It was about 8 in high and extended just over 18 in from the wall. The dimensions didn't suggest seating for practical purposes. There was no room to sit fully upright, and the ceiling sloped downward in a way that made prolonged occupation unlikely. That led to one theory. The ledge may have been used to place objects, not people. If the space had a symbolic or ceremonial function, that would line up with how other parts of the site operated. Enclosures A, B, and D all featured carved, T-shaped pillars arranged in circular formations, likely with ritual significance. However, this chamber had no vertical pillars, no decorated wall panels, and no freestanding sculptures. It was bare except for a few faint relief carvings near the entrance. That made its simplicity just as interesting as any elaborate design. Some of the team compared the layout to porthole stones found elsewhere at the site, round or rectangular openings carved into stone slabs, usually installed in enclosure walls. These were likely symbolic entryways or transitions between spaces. In this case, the rectangular chamber and its hidden placement suggests the builders may have taken the porthole idea one step further. An actual carved space where something or someone was meant to enter, remain, and never return. The location of the chamber also mattered. It was situated in a part of the hill with no other excavated enclosures nearby. That meant it wasn't simply an offshoot of an existing structure. It was on its own, deliberately isolated and intentionally sealed. That led to another possible interpretation. The chamber could have served as a kind of ritual cache. In other prehistoric sites, small stone-lined pits or carved spaces were used to store offerings, symbolic tools, or even body parts. But unlike those examples, this space wasn't filled. If anything had been placed there, it was removed before the chamber was sealed or it decayed without a trace. One insider on the excavation team noted that the clean condition of the chamber interior, the smooth surfaces, the undisturbed ledge, and the lack of any post-construction marks suggest it may have been used only once. That fits with the idea that the chamber was symbolic rather than functional. A place meant to be made, used, and then buried. To better understand it, researchers compared 3D models of the chamber with known features at Göbekli and neighboring sites like Karahipi. Nothing matched. The chamber didn't fit any known pattern. It was unique. That uniqueness is what left the team, in their own words, speechless. In a site full of spectacular carvings and monumental architecture, it was a small hidden space that carried the most weight. It raised an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. If something like this existed and remained undiscovered for more than 10,000 years, what else could still be buried under the hill? The effect. The chamber discovery had an immediate effect on how archaeologists approached the site. The find didn't just add a new structure to Göbekli's layout. It forced a reevaluation of what the site might have included all along. Nexmi Karl, the lead archaeologist, initiated a temporary pause in some of the other planned excavation zones. Instead, the team redirected resources to carry out a full subsurface survey of the chamber's surrounding area. That included additional ground-penetrating radar scans, seismic tests, and resistivity surveys across a broader radius. What they found was subtle but important. Faint signatures in the bedrock that hinted at other possible voids. Not large, not pillar-lined, but similar in size and depth to the revealed chamber. These anomalies haven't been excavated yet, but they're now marked for future seasons. The idea that Göbekli might contain not just surface structures, but also carved internal features adds a whole new layer to how the site is interpreted. Up until now, the emphasis has always been on the large circular enclosures, the towering T-shaped pillars, and the animal reliefs. These are the symbols most people associate with the site. But the chamber shows that the builders weren't only looking upward or outward. They were also working below, cutting into the stone with purpose. The cultural implications are significant. If the chamber was used in Arari context, it could suggest that Göbekli was not just a place of gathering, ritual, or feasting, but also of memory and burial. If it was used for symbolic storage or offerings, it could point to more complex religious beliefs than previously assumed, perhaps involving hidden acts of devotion carried out away from the eyes of the wider community. So, what do you think it will turn out to be? Let us know in the comments.